Today is Tuesday, July 21st, 2026, and today is National Junk Food Day, which is one of those national days that doesn't even pretend to be healthy. Nobody has ever looked at a bag of potato chips and said, "I'm really doing this for the nutritional value." Sometimes it's okay to enjoy something simply because it's enjoyable, preferably in moderation. And as I wandered through today's history, I noticed something that connected all of our stories. None of them began as icons. They started as practical ideas. A cable across an ocean, a new animated movie, and an army training camp. At the time, nobody could have known these ordinary beginnings would eventually become names recognized around the world. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who keeps finding historical stories that sound completely fake until you realize they actually happened. Our first story begins beneath the Atlantic Ocean. On July 21st, 1866, workers successfully completed the first permanent transatlantic telegraph cable, forever changing how the world communicated. It's difficult to appreciate just how revolutionary that was. Before the cable, sending messages from North America to Europe meant putting it on a ship. Even under the best conditions, the trip could take more than a week. Important news, business decisions, diplomatic negotiations, even family messages all traveled only as fast as the fastest vessel crossing the Atlantic. The ocean wasn't just a body of water. It was a communication barrier. People had dreamed of connecting the continents with a telegraph cable for years, but turning that dream into reality proved extraordinarily difficult. The first attempts ended in disappointment. Storms interrupted the work. One cable functioned briefly before failing altogether. Many people began wondering whether the entire idea was simply impossible, but engineers refused to give up. Using the enormous steamship Great Eastern, specifically designed to carry thousands of miles of cable, crews carefully laid a new line across the ocean floor. When the final connection was made, messages that once took days or even weeks could suddenly be exchanged in a matter of minutes. For the first time in history, Europe and North America could communicate almost as though they were neighbors. Newspapers received international news faster than ever before. Businesses could negotiate across oceans without waiting for ships. Governments suddenly found themselves making decisions based on information that was nearly immediate instead of weeks old. It didn't just make communication faster, it made the world feel smaller. I've always found that amazing because the internet often gets credit for connecting the world. In many ways, the first real step happened more than a century earlier, when a group of determined engineers decided that an ocean didn't have to keep people apart. Speaking of ordinary ideas that quietly grew into something much bigger, our next story introduces an animated film that proved Disney wasn't the only studio dreaming on a grand scale. Because it reminds us that even when one company seems to own an industry, someone else is usually working just as hard to prove there's room for another great idea. On July 21st, 1939, audiences were introduced to Gulliver's Travels, the first feature-length animated film produced by an American studio outside of Disney. Today, feature-length animated movies are everywhere. Pixar, DreamWorks, Illumination, Sony Pictures Animation. Audiences expect animated films to tell stories that can fill an entire evening. But in 1939, that was still a remarkably new concept. Just 2 years earlier, Disney had stunned Hollywood with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Many critics had predicted audiences would never sit through a feature-length cartoon. Instead, it became one of the biggest successes in movie history. That success inspired other studios to ask an important question. Could they do it too? Fleischer Studios certainly thought so. The studio was already famous for creating Betty Boop, Popeye the Sailor, and Superman cartoons. Their artists had developed innovative animation techniques that weren't afraid to experiment with visual storytelling. Their answer was Gulliver's Travels, based on Jonathan Swift's classic novel. The film blended impressive animation, memorable music, and a level of artistic ambition that showed audiences Disney didn't have a monopoly on imagination. While it never reached the legendary status of Snow White, it became one of the highest-grossing films of 1939 and proved there was room for more than one major player in feature animation. I've always appreciated stories like this because competition often pushes everyone to become better. Sometimes history isn't about replacing the leader. It's about proving the leader isn't alone anymore. And speaking of places that became famous for something they weren't originally known for, our final story begins with an ordinary army training camp in Kentucky. On July 21, 1918, the U.S. Army established Camp Knox as an artillery training center during World War I. At the time, there was nothing especially remarkable about it. America was rapidly expanding its military to support the war effort, and new training camps were appearing across the country. Camp Knox was simply one of many places preparing soldiers for service overseas. No one could have guessed that the name Knox would eventually become synonymous with security itself. After World War I, the camp continued to grow and eventually became Fort Knox, one of the Army's most important military installations. Then, in the 1930s, another chapter began. The United States Bullion Depository was built there to safeguard the nation's gold reserves. Constructed with massive granite walls, reinforced concrete, a vault door weighing more than 20 tons, and layers of physical and military security, it quickly developed an almost mythical reputation. Today, when someone says something is locked up tighter than Fort Knox, everyone understands exactly what they mean, even if they've never seen the facility. It's fascinating that a place originally created to train soldiers became one of the world's most recognizable symbols of security. Sometimes history doesn't make something famous because of how it begins. It becomes famous because of what it grows into. And before we wrap up today's stories, today's birthday belongs to Don Knotts, who was born on July 21st, 1924. If you've ever laughed at Barney Fife fumbling his way through an episode of The Andy Griffith Show, you've experienced Don Knotts at his very best. Born in Morgantown, West Virginia, Knotts discovered early that he had a gift for comedy. After serving in the U.S. Army during World War II, he pursued acting, appearing on the radio, television, and stage before landing the role that would define his career. As Deputy Barney Fife, Knotts created a character who was nervous, overly confident, wonderfully awkward, and somehow impossible not to love. His performance earned him 5 Emmy Awards and made Barney one of television's most memorable comedic characters. But Knotts' career extended well beyond Mayberry. He starred in successful Disney films, appeared in numerous television shows, and introduced his unique brand of lovable comedy to generations of audiences. What made Don Knotts so special wasn't that he played the hero. He played ordinary people with ordinary fears, exaggerated just enough to remind us of ourselves. The more I thought about today's stories, the more I realized they all began with something surprisingly humble. A cable laid across the ocean floor. An animated film from a studio trying to prove itself. A military training camp. A comedian from West Virginia. None of them look like legends at the beginning. History has a wonderful habit of taking ordinary beginnings and allowing them to become extraordinary through time, persistence, and the people who believe in them. Anyway, after today's research, I couldn't help thinking about how many famous names started out as places, projects, or people that hardly anyone noticed. It makes you wonder which ordinary thing around us today will become tomorrow's household name. But before I leave, I'll leave you with this thought from Don Knotts himself. Everybody in this world has a job to do, and it's all worthwhile. If you'd like to hear more of my work, audiobooks, or other projects I've somehow gotten myself involved in, you can find everything over at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and honestly, thank you for spending a little time being curious with me. I'll see you tomorrow.